Greetings everyone, my name is Jeff here at HoganWorks, and today we're going to be walking through painting a Tyranid Carnifex. The finished result will be something along the lines of this guy here, which was featured on my Instagram channel. This being the Thornback that I painted. There we go. So we're going to be looking at something pretty similar to this. I have a proper Carnifex as it is. Just get that refocused. And we're going to be putting that together. I'm going to show you the priming steps, how to do a kind of a light zenithal highlighting, and then going through all of the different parts and pieces and getting to the final step and polish. So what I've done here is I've broken him up into pieces. These are my sub-assemblies. I did paint this guy over here as one complete piece, but definitely found it to be a little challenging. So with this guy, I split him up. So I've got the major pieces and kind of the areas where I had the most difficulty with the overlaps. So between the lower torso and the main body, the neck and the main body, and getting to the rib cage and stuff around the weapons. Hopefully this will make it a little bit easier to get this together, and we'll go from there. Thanks. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our Carnifex primered. And to do that, I'm going to start out with this Stynylrez Black Primer. I've recently got into the Stynylrez primers, and I have to say I'm pretty happy with them. I've used the red, brown to do all of my Imperial Fist to go up to a yellow, and I've been pretty happy with that. I have been using the Vallejo primers as well, but we're going to give the black a try for this one. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this into my palette here. Not my wet palette, I use this for my airbrush specifically. And see, this is the first time I've used that. Now, although some of these are listed as airbrush, I don't think this one is in particular. They are always pretty thick. So what I tend to do is do a mix where I'll add in a combination of Airbrush Flow Improver and Airbrush Thinner, both by Vallejo. Only a little bit of the Flow Improver here. It tends to be kind of a thicker, glossier medium, so I just do a little bit, and then I tend to do quite a bit of the Airbrush Thinner, depending, of course, upon the actual paint I'm trying to thin, but oftentimes, 40%, 30% at the very least of the thinner to the actual paint. And what I've done is I've bought a number of these smaller squeeze eyedropper bottles. This makes it a lot easier to put things into the airbrush. So let me turn this so where you can see it. I'm going to go ahead and put quite a bit of that thinner in there. And then I'm going to give it a few drops of the Airbrush Flow Improver. And then something that I like to use to do transfers and to stir are these little plastic pipettes. They're really cheap on Amazon. You can get, 100, 200 at a time. And I find these really help as far as transferring paints around to the airbrush when I need to do any kind of mixing. Although I know you can mix in the airbrush itself. Sometimes when you're layering together different chemicals inside of your airbrush pot, mixing them together can be a little difficult. You'll end up trying to get to that mixture, and you'll have some of the primer that's the thicker paint down towards the needle, so I just do this because it makes life a little easier. Okay, I'll grab my harder-steenbeck evolution. I really love this airbrush, super happy with it. And I'm going to just grab some of this and deposit it right down in my airbrush pot. All right, looking good. So we're going to go through and we're just going to give this guy a nice prime. As you're doing this, make sure to move the airbrush around. You don't want to build it up too much in one area, as you'll get runs and drips and all kinds of nasty effects. On top of that, if you do end up having to thin down the paint quite a bit, that will be even more of an issue because it will be much less viscous and it will have a tendency to get pushed around by the air. And all these are too, these are just dowels from the local hardwood store or from the local, box store that I've cut down and then cut in half on a bandsaw to give me a nice sturdy platform. I use corks for the smaller pieces, but for when you get to the heavier items, you really need to have a bigger piece. Also, you really should be wearing a mask here. I'm just not, so I can talk to you. Okay, there we go. That's looking pretty good there. So move on to the next piece. And you absolutely can use a rattle can for this kind of stuff, especially if you've already broken them apart. And a lot of times it can save you a little bit of stress later. Because a lot of times what will happen with airbrush paints is that they'll be acrylic and they won't stick to the plastic very well. So you end up scratching it or digging into it and really wrecking a lot of your work. The paint that comes out of a spray can tends to bond with that layer of plastic and can be a little bit easier. On the other hand, if you're just starting out with an airbrush, then priming is a great way to practice because it's a lot harder to kind of make those goofs and you get much better at that two-step finger control with your airbrush. So I'll give this a little reload. Keep going here. These bigger pieces can be a little uncooperative. What I'll do is I'll just leave that down. And nothing wrong too with coming back to something that you've done a light coat on if it's too wet and hitting it again. Like I can see from this that that's a pretty light translucent coat of primer I'm putting down, so I'm going to come back to it a couple times to build that up. Sorry. Okay. And with that, we've got our first layer down. I'm going to let these dry for a little while, maybe touch them up a little bit to see if there is anything else that needs to be corrected, and then we'll go on to the zenithal highlighting. All right, so now that we've let that first layer dry, I'm going to go back over with some white stynol res, and we're going to do the zenithal highlight. And what this entails, we basically take our airbrush and restrict the direction that we spray it from to try and imitate the very highest highlights on our figurine. This means that when we put our base layers over top of it, which should be fairly thin, that you'll get a kind of a natural gradation between the darkest areas of the model, still primed in black, and the lighter areas of the model that are now primed in white. So, I've already given my airbrush a good cleaning out and prepared this, so we're going to do the same thing that we did. Let me pull this in here. We're going to put some of this white down, and white is definitely has a lot of pigment in it, so it does benefit quite a bit from having a little bit extra thinner thrown into it. Flow improver, grab a new pipette. There we go. All right, and we'll just transfer some of this into our airbrush. We won't need as much because we're not covering the entire model. We're just picking out the very highest highlights. All right, let's start with this lower section here. Now, when I take a second to look over this to see exactly what areas I think are going to be the highest, what I can say is that the top of the legs up through here and right around the ankle and the foot area here are going to be where I'm going to want my highlights to be, right along those really high muscles and along those armor plates, along with just down the back of his spine and along the tip of his tail. So that's where I'm going to place my white highlights. And as you can see, my paint is fairly thin here. It's very translucent, which is going to allow me to control how thick and how vibrant that white is as I build it up, giving me yet another ability to gradate that white up. Just like that. Let's do a little bit more on his leg here. Just like that. And then we'll do the same thing down his spine here. We'll do a real thin layer culminating at the tip of his tail. Just like that. And then we'll highlight that up again. Just on his tail. Just like that. And then we'll repeat that same process on his other leg. All right, just like that. And I think I'm pretty happy with that. This is definitely a tough part because it's very easy to go over top of this in a really thick layer and kind of wipe out these highlights. So it's definitely a process of trial and error, and every model is different. Move on here to his death spitters. And as I'm doing this, I'm definitely thinking about where I want those brightest highlights to be. Where do I want to draw the eye of the viewer? And for me, like, I would like to see that tip of that death spitter grab your attention. So that's the part that I am going to work on highlighting up the most. Just like that. And these should be pretty quick. You know, we're going to be doing a lot of work on the detailing and so forth as we go along. So we're going to try and, save a little time here. Now, when it comes to the head and face, this is where we want our viewer to really get the most interest in when we look at our model. So I'm going to really work on getting these gradients up and getting some nice bright highlights. All right, there we go. This is the connector for the venom cannon. Just like that. The venom cannon itself, so much like the death spitters, I want to follow along the tip of the barrel. go. And finally, we've got the main body here. And this is going to be a little different too, because what I want to do is I want to kind of reinforce a gradient that's going to happen as we go down the body plates on his back. So what I'm going to try and do is emulate that here to make my blending a little bit easier. Now right there, what I did is I put a little bit too much down at once. So I'm using just the air on my air gun to try and get that cleaned up. And if it's a little rough now, we should be okay. In fact, I might just pull that layer off and fill it back in. There. And then for the most part, that's most of the highlighting that I want to do, because everything else, like his rib cage, is going to be pointed down to the ground anyways, so it's going to be a lot more shadowed. And that, I think, does it for our basic zenithal highlighting. And once again, your mileage may vary. This is definitely a learning process for me. It will be for everyone. And keep practicing. Thanks for tuning in to part 1 of painting the Carnifex. We're going to stop here because I want to make sure the videos don't end up running on too long. And it also helps that if you're looking for a particular technique, you'll be able to go to the part of the video that focuses on it. So in this video, we really worked on using the airbrush to do our base coating and our priming, as well as doing some zenithal highlighting and really more focused on some pre-highlighting. From this point on, we're going to move on next week into putting down our base colors and our skin tones, doing our base shading on that, highlighting up the skin, and then starting to work on the back armor plates. So thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you next time. Thanks.